All right, so just a quick overview of the agenda today. So we're going to review some common reporting terms that you might see on the reporting pages. We're going to review the reporting eligibility criteria. So I know a lot of you have been asking, when I download this report, I get this count, but then when I download this report, I get a different count, and why is that? And that's because each report has a different criteria that allows it to be, that students need to meet in order to show up on that report, and so we're going to go over that. Then we're just going to briefly do an overview of the reports page. I know we've done that in the past, but I'm also going to do a brief demo of how to run a report in case you're really new to DAISI. And then we are going to go over the Pentaho Ad Hoc Tool. And this, I will admit, is a more challenging part of the training. It's probably one of the more challenging things that we've done. So again, if you'd rather just wait until the custom reporting tools are stored or the student testing report is stored, then I recommend just tuning out after the reports page, and then I will be keeping you all updated when that functionality is restored. And then after that, we're going to review some quick Excel tools that might be helpful when dealing with those ad hoc reports, because sometimes they download in an error that in an order that's kind of funky, or you'll have duplicates. So I'm going to show you some things that you can use in Excel in order to get past that. Reports, you might see this drop-down menu labeled AH filter, or attendance hours filter. So what the AH filter means is it excludes post-tests that were administered too early. And what I mean by too early is each test, or NRS-approved tests like the TABE and the CASA, has a minimum number of hours that students need to attend before they take their post-test. So for the TABE, it's 40 hours. So if a student took a pre-test and then they only have 30 attendance hours and then they take their TABE post-test, that test would not show up on a report with the attendance hours filter on. I've heard that most reports automatically have this filter, so you shouldn't need to pay too much attention to it because most of the tests that are administered too early shouldn't show up on your reports anyways. But just in case you're curious, that's what that means. Then there's this cumulative drop-down menu that you might notice. Cumulative means that it contains all data collected through the specified quarter. So a lot of the reports that you'll see on the reports page have a quarter drop-down list. So if you were to choose, let's say, quarter 3, and you were to say cumulative true, that would mean that your report is going to show all data from quarters 1 through quarter 3. If you were to say false, then it would only, show the data from quarters 3. Then there's this distinction between error and warning. So an error has this symbol here on the student page. It's a little red circle. And an error critically impacts the validity of your data. So it'll prevent students from appearing on all reports, and it also prevents students from being counted towards generation. A warning has this yellow triangle symbol, and it's a little bit less serious. So it doesn't prevent students from appearing on reports, and it also doesn't prevent them from being counted towards generation. But if keeping your data clean and up to date is really important, then there's something that you can pay attention to. So next we're going to review the report eligibility. So for the enrollment report, a student must be error-free, and in a fixed entry class, they must have accrued 7.5 or more attendance hours and reached their midterm in that class where they've attended 7.5 or more attendance hours. And also, one tricky thing that came up recently is attendance needs to be entered through the midterm date. So let's use today as an example. So it's November 4th. let's say a student's midterm was October 30th, but attendance in that class is only entered through October 15th. Even though we've reached the midterm date and that if that student has accrued 7.5 attendance hours, that student still isn't going to show up on the report, on the enrollment report, because attendance hasn't been entered through that midterm date. So if you're looking at an enrollment report and you're noticing, wow, this number seems really low, go ahead and check your attendance entry and make sure that it's up to date, and then maybe run a policy job and run those reports again and see if that makes a difference. For an open entry class, it's a little more simple. A student just needs to have accrued 7.5 or more attendance hours before dropping. The master list report is pretty similar. So a student must be error-free. They must have accrued 7.5 or more attendance hours. They must have reached their midterm date, and they must have attendance hours entered through the midterm date, as I was mentioning before. And for open entry classes, just as before, they must have accrued 7.5 or more attendance hours prior to dropping. And this criteria is specific to the master list report, so they must have generated hours for the funding source specified. So for a master list report, you can actually only run a report for one funding source at a time. So you'll notice that there will be a drop-down menu, and it'll have all the funding sources listed. And so let's say you're running a report for 4805, that federal EL Civics funding source. Unless a student has generated hours for that 4805 funding source, they will not appear on that master list report that you've generated. And before we go on, I just noticed that someone mentioned, oh, I can't see you. That is because when I was editing the last training, I noticed that my audio was breaking up during some parts of it, and I'm guessing that was because of some bandwidth issues. So in order to make sure that my audio is clear this time, I've decided not to use video. I also noticed someone else asked, will the PowerPoint used for this training be available? Yes, I will be sending it out after the training. So don't worry about scrambling to take notes. Next is the program status report. So in order to appear on a program status report, a student must be error-free. The fixed entry and open entry criteria are the same as they were for the previous reports. And the hours described above must be funded by restricted AEFL funds. So any unrestricted funding source will not be included on this report. And again, they must have generated hours for the funding source specified in that drop-down menu that you'll see. And finally, we have NRS reports. So the criteria listed here are applicable to all reports related to the NRS. So that's your NRS core performance measures report. And I believe there's one other that is escaping me right now. But when we go over to the reports page, I'll be able to point that out for you. So the NRS reports are a little different in that instead of 7.5 hours, a student must have accrued 12 or more attendance hours in order to appear on these reports. And also, something that's specific to NRS reports is students that are enrolled exclusively in vocational or foreign language GED classes will also not be included. So if you run an NRS report and you notice it's significant that your attendance hours or measurable skill gains are significantly lower than other reports that you run, then check to see how many students you have enrolled exclusively in these two types of classes and see if that might be the explanation. So before I go on to the reports page, I wanted to review this report that will be released soon, and it's called the NRS POPs, or Periods of Participation Report. And it'll show data instead of by individual, it shows data by period of participation. And what I mean by that is a period of participation is the time from which a student starts or is enrolled to the time in which they exit. So a student can actually have more than one period of participation in a single fiscal year. If they attend the class in the fall, they exit the class, and then maybe in the spring they decide to re-enroll. So that student would have 2 periods of participation, and those 2 periods of participation would show up differently on the NRS report. And this report is really helpful because it kind of gives you a glance at what we look at as the state. So everything that we go through as a state and we submit to Octave, that is what you are going to be seeing specifically for your program. So it shows your student demographics broken up by education functioning level. It shows the student count in each program type. And you'll notice that ESL, or English as a second language, is actually broken up into 2 categories. So you'll see the count for English language acquisition and also for integrated English literacy and civics education. And these 2 categories on your report will be mutually exclusive. So if a student is in IELTE, they will not be counted again in ELA. And it also shows measurable skill gains by all of these different categories. So by their education functioning level, it shows MSGs by just by level gains, and it'll show them by level gain in attendance hours for pre and post tested participants, and also specifically for distance learners. So here's just one example of a table that'll be on that report. So you might notice it looks a little bit different than the reports that you have available to you now. So it has all of the educational functioning levels listed, and then it has all of these different measures of measurable skill gains. So it'll tell you the number of periods of participation with measurable skill gains, the total number of periods of participation, the total number of students who attained a secondary school diploma or its equivalent, and et cetera. All right. So next, we are going to go over to DAISI, and we're going to review that reports page. So when you log into DAISI, you should see a screen similar to this. Just going to make sure that I'm still logged in. And in order to view the reports page, you just click this reports link right here. And again, I'm using my my state account today instead of the demo account. The reports page on the demo account doesn't really work that well. So I wanted to make sure that I'm giving you something, demonstrating something that actually works with you all. So you obviously won't have this state level categorization, so you can just go ahead and ignore that. So as I was saying, when you log in, you should be able to see the Pentaho homepage link right here at the top. You should see the error check reports, the required reports, and the static reports. So these error check reports will tell you about any errors that I was talking about earlier that will critically impact the validity of your data, prevent students from showing up on other reports, etc. Then you have required reports. These are submitted 4 times a year. It might be a little bit different this year just because of COVID-19 and the uncertainty that we're facing. And then you also have these static reports, and these are really helpful for giving you a closer look at any other measure that you want to keep track of. So there's one specifically for EL Civics, there's one specifically for GED, high school equivalency, instructor individual outcomes, etc. So I'm just going to briefly demonstrate how to run a report using the student error details report. Here we go. So once you click on the report, you should see something like this. So you have the ability to choose a program name. If you are a program with specific college, with several colleges, then you can choose a specific college to look at. Here are those attendance. You can choose the minimum attendance hours that you want a student to have. So if you only want to see errors for students that would show up on an NRS report, then you can choose 12. If you want to see errors for students that would otherwise show up on any of the other required reports, you can choose 7.5. You can choose the funding source, the error type, And one thing I wanted to point out was this number of errors field here. So it defaults to 100, and then you have two other options, 1,000 or all. I recommend choosing all just to make sure that this report captures all of the errors in your system and that you're not missing out on any. And another thing I wanted to mention was if you leave any of these fields that are left blank, will essentially just be defaulted to not specified. So you don't actually have to choose not specified for each of these fields. It'll just default to that if the field is left blank. And then you can also choose the output type. I'm going to choose PDF just because I can't actually show you any student info. And then you'll click View Report, and the report should download right in that part of the page. Great. So next we are going to move on to the Pentaho Ad Hoc Tool. Again, and just to preface, this is going to be a part of the training that is relatively challenging. So if you're someone that would rather just wait for the custom reporting tool and the student testing report to be restored, then you're welcome to log out of this training now. And it will be posted later this week, and I will also send you the PowerPoint that I was using earlier. So in order to use the Pentaho tool, just click on the Pentaho homepage link. Here we go. And the only thing that you want to focus on is the Create New button. So you'll click that, and then it'll give you all of these options. The one that you'll choose is WAQR. None of these other ones are going to give you the information that you need. So just click the second option, WAQR. So then you'll see all of these different options that you have here. So you can apply a template. So this just kind of changes the different colors that will be in your report. And then the data source that you will use is the AE Providers Ad Hoc. A lot of these other data sources that are available here, they contain information that might not be as useful for you, and a lot of them are redundant. So this first data source here should have everything that you need. And then you'll click Next. And don't be overwhelmed. I know that this looks like a lot. So these are all of the fields that are available to add to your report. So the available items, this header here, this is kind of an overarching, this is showing you that each of these headings for each of these sections is an overarching category by which the items in the category are sorted. So for example, if I choose student classes and I add attendance hours from student classes, that means that it's going to show me the attendance hours for that class. Whereas if I choose, where's the equivalent? So attendance hours ESL, and I add that in there, that's going to show me the attendance hours for the ESL category for that specific student. So I recommend trying to stay within one of these categories. Otherwise, it just gets kind of confusing. You'll get duplicates, and it'll be a little bit hard to decipher what each row in your report means. So I'll go ahead and delete those. And I'm just going to run a super simple report. So let's say I want to run a report that has the name of every student in my program. I'll add, let's see, the different attendance hours for the different instructional categories. You can just add those one by one. You can add the class dates. You can add some funding sources if you want, and I'm not going to go too into detail. And then there are also these other categories that you have here on the side. So the first one is groups. So the groups will determine how the results will be organized in your report. So let's say I wanted all of these fields, but I wanted them to be organized by class. So in order to do that, I could just add the class number to group 1, And that will create a report that has all of the students in a class and each of the classes listed one by one. Now, I will say that adding a group will, it kind of makes your report less flexible in that once you download the Excel spreadsheet, you're going to have a lot of blank rows. You might have, it'll just be harder to sort it. So if you're not planning to play with your report in any way, you're not planning to do any calculations with it, or you're not planning to resort it in any way, then I would sure go ahead and add some groups if you want to change how the results will be sorted. Otherwise, I recommend leaving all of these fields blank because it just makes your report a little bit more pliable. And then finally, you have these filters down at the bottom, and these are really helpful because they allow you to filter out your results for a specific anything, really. So if you wanted to see just the results for a single fiscal year, then you can choose the fiscal year and just drop it right into that filter here. And one last thing that I wanted to show you before we leave this page is I know you're all looking at this and thinking, oh my goodness, this is really overwhelming. These aren't even in alphabetical order. How am I ever going to find the fields that I'm looking for in order to create my report? So one handy thing that you can use is that Control F tool. So that's Control Find. You'll just press Control F on your keyboard, and then this little search bar comes up. And this helps you find, quickly find a field that you're looking for. So if you're looking for a class start date, then you can enter class. So if 35 come up, maybe I want to make it a little more narrow, then I can just change it to start. And it'll highlight the fields that contain that word that you searched for. So I highly recommend using this because I personally have spent a lot of time on this page trying to find the fields that I'm looking for. So I know how frustrating that can be. So once you have your details and your filters and your groups looking the way that you want them to, you can press Next. Then you'll come to a page that looks like this. And here's where you apply all of your filters. So in order to do that, you just press the name of the filter or the name of the field that you want to filter for, and you press Add a Constraint. And you have all of these different options here. Excuse me. So you can choose, let's say I want to only see results from fiscal year 2021. I can also say I want any year that happened after 2017, every year that happened after 2017, including 2017, etc. So I'll just say 2021. And then in order to apply the filter, just press this tiny little checkbox next to it. And if you want to get rid of a filter, you can just press this X here. Then you'll press Next. And then I'm not going to do this because, again, I am not allowed to present any personally identifying information on a training. Then you would just choose the file type here. I recommend downloading it as a CSV, which stands for comma separated values. This tends to be the file type that works the best with these kinds of reports. And don't worry about having to learn how to use a new file type or anything. When you open it, it will open up as an Excel. And then you can just press Go, and that's it. So that's a tool that you can play with. I recommend not using it right now during this training just because Pentaho is one of those sites that can tend to get a little slow when there are a lot of users using it at the same time. So I recommend trying it out later in this week. Maybe you can pull up the recording of this video and try it out. Great. So next, we are going to pull up an example of what an ad hoc report might look like and show you how to make it useful. So I have this ad hoc report here, you wouldn't have two tabs. Each of your reports that you download is only going to be one tab, but I just wanted to show you a couple of different tools, so I needed to have two different data types here. So I have this first one here. Like I mentioned, Pentaho has a weird way of sorting the entries in a report. So you might get something that looks like this. Notice that there's really no order to my students here. There's not really an order to my classes. You might notice that some of my classes are duplicated here. Some of my students, if you look really closely, are duplicated as well. So I'm thinking to myself, how am I even going to use this? So one way that you can quickly figure out how many students or how many classes are in a report are to use this, the remove duplicates feature right here. So let's say I want to figure out how many unique students I have, but I don't want to delete this list of students because I might need to use it later. So what I could do is I could just right-click, copy, and then just paste this row somewhere else in this sheet. And I'm going to use the values paste just because sometimes when you use that first paste option, it'll just give you some weird formatting stuff. Sometimes it'll be referring to a new, to a formula that you use. So I just always recommend using this paste values function. And then I'm going to change this column name. I need to do that. I'm going to change this column name to unique students. And all right, so I'm going to highlight this row, or this column rather, click the remove duplicates, and it'll come up with this little box here. And it knows that I'm trying to remove duplicates from column K, and I'll say, yes, my column has headers so that it doesn't try to sort my, or take away my unique students header there. And then just press OK. And then that'll come up with a message. So there were 107 duplicate values and 170 unique values remain. So that means that I have 170 unique students in my report. So now I have each student only appearing once, but they're still in this random order, so that's not really that helpful. So in order to fix that, I can, again, highlight column K, or even just highlight only the students in column K, because I don't want to sort my header out there, again. And then on the data tab, there's also this A to Z tool. So it'll, when I click this, it'll just automatically sort my students from least to greatest. And again, I kind of did something silly. I used, if I wanted them to actually appear in numerical order, I would have had to use 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, etc. But when you do this with alphabetical student names, I promise it'll actually come up in alphabetical order. Another useful thing that you can use is a pivot table. So here I have a similar ad hoc sheet, and I have all of these different fields. So let's say I wanted to know how many classes is each student in my report taking. So I'll just go to the Insert tab and then press Pivot Table. And the nice thing about Excel is it automatically detects the number of rows in your sheet. So looks like I have 2,927 rows, and I want to put my pivot table in a new worksheet, and I'll just press OK. And then you have this pane on the right side that shows you all of your row titles, and then you have these options here. So I can turn each one of these can I view how to access that page? So in order to access a different sheet, you just click on the little tabs at the bottom here. Sorry, forgot to mention that. So in each of these column headers can be turned into a column or a row. So I want to figure out how many classes each of my students is taking. So I want to turn my student name into the rows. So it'll list each of my students once. And then I want to change my class number into the values. And what that does is it changes, it'll tell you the count of unique class numbers for each student. So what that means is this student has one unique class number, so they're only taking one class. This student has 6 unique class numbers associated with their name, so they're taking 6 classes, etc. One thing I do want to mention is if you go back to my raw data here, you'll notice that my class numbers contain a word. So Excel was smart enough to figure out, okay, I can't add all of these things because there are words associated with them, so I'm going to count them instead. But if you had a different field like class exit code or attendance hours, Excel probably isn't going to figure out that this is, or at least in the case of exit codes, it's not going to be smart enough to figure out that this is a name instead of a number. So what it would probably do, and I can even show you that here, is, oh, it actually was smart enough. Look at that. What is this? Yeah, class exit code. Look at that. It was smart enough. But sometimes it'll do something like it'll add them all up instead. And that doesn't really mean anything, right? So in order to change that, you click on the arrow next to the field, go to Value Field Settings, and then you can choose all of these different ways to summarize your data. So you can count them, you can take the average, the max or the minimum, etc. So again, let's say we want to know how many times a student has exited a class, and we can count them. And now we'll see that here. So now we have even more information. So the student has taken 6 classes, and they've exited from all 6 of them. So that's pretty cool. So this is, again, just a really easy way to summarize the data in your ad hoc report after, or clean it up in a way that makes it readable. Another thing that I wanted to mention about Excel is when I highlight a column, you'll get this count right here in this in the lower right-hand corner. And this is useful because let's say I want to see how many students are in my report, but I don't want to use this duplicate function here. I think it's a little sloppy. Instead, I can just highlight this column, and I see that I have 1,417 cells that have data in them. So I know that there's one header row, and usually all the way here at the bottom of my list, if I scroll all the way down, there's a grand total row as well. So that means that there are 2 rows that don't have that I'm counting, but that aren't actually student names. So in order to figure out how many students I have, I'll just take this count, 1,417, and subtract 2, once for the header and once for the grand total. So that means I have 1,417 students. And another way that you can use that is if you're highlighting numeric values, it'll actually count the number of values, it'll automatically take the average of them, and it also takes the sum of them. So that can be a really useful way. Let's say I'm just looking at, let's say I want to, instead of creating that pivot table, I'm just going to create a filter in order to sort them. So let's say I want to be able to look at this sheet, and I want all of the students to be together. So you can highlight the top row, and then go to the Data tab, and then click this filter icon here. It kind of looks like a funnel. And then each row, or each column header has this little arrow next to it. And this is useful for a variety of reasons, because it'll tell me all of the unique values, so I can filter for a certain date if I want to. Like, let's say I only want to look at July, then I can undo select all, just click July. And usually I just use this for the sort feature. So let's say I just want to sort all of the student names A to Z. So I can just click that, click sort A to Z. And then the nice thing about the filters is that it actually groups all of the columns together. So I'm not just sorting this row, I'm actually sorting the entire sheet by this row. So each, I'm sorting the entire sheet by this column. And each row is going to stick together, so I don't have to worry about my data becoming all jumbled up. So now I have each student kind of listed one by one. So if I wanted to find quickly the instructional, the attendance hours for one student, I could just highlight the columns associated with, or I could highlight the rows, just can't get it right today. I could highlight the rows associated with student 10, and then I can see that this student 10 has a sum of 32.98 attendance hours. So I know I just threw a lot at you, so we're going to stop here and we're going to use the rest of our time for questions. And again, I'm just going to display the additional support screen. So this is, again, just the links to all of the additional support options that you have available to you. So here's the link to the online help guide, the email address of the DAISI help desk if you have any questions about how things work or you suspect that there might be something that's not working properly, you can email them. Here's my contact information if you have any specific questions related to your program. And as always, the contact information of the regional support staff. And they can usually help you with any DAISI questions or any policy-related questions that you have.